Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to talk about, well, marching toward federal insolvency. I don't know why you nice people asked me here to talk about such a depressing thing, but here it is. This is the federal debt going back to 1970. As of last week, $30,425,659,073,319.04. That's the total official debt of the federal government. Now, how much is $30 trillion? Well, if you go to Germany, and in Germany you visit every city, and in every city you go to every store, and in every store you look on every shelf and you buy everything, you will not have spent $30 trillion. You've got to go to France also, and England, and while you're there you can go to Scotland and Ireland, and you still would not have spent $30 trillion. You can buy everything in every city in Europe, and you still would not have spent $30 trillion. You've got to buy everything for sale in China also. All of that, every item on every shelf in every city in each one of those countries, the price tag for that is $30 trillion. That's the official amount of money our federal government owes. And who did we borrow this money from? Well, $6 trillion plus comes from the Federal Reserve. Another $6.5 trillion comes from Social Security and federal pensions. $7.6 trillion comes from foreign entities. That's foreign people, foreign governments, foreign corporations. Another $10 trillion comes from non-federal domestic entities. This is American citizens, American companies, and also U.S. states and local governments have loaned a total of $10 trillion to the federal government. That's the $30 trillion. So when you hear this nonsense about, well, we can ignore the debt because that's money we owe ourselves, that's only true if you very loosely define ourselves. Because in fact, we owe specific people this money. And here's a breakdown of some of them. And that's not the end of the story. Because in addition to the federal debt, we also have this animal that we call unfunded liabilities or unfunded obligations. This is an amount of money the federal government doesn't legally owe, but it has overtly promised this money to certain people, and it won't have the money on hand to pay what it has promised. Most of this is promises in the form of Social Security, retirement benefits, government pension benefits, Medicare. And if you take all of the money that the federal government has promised to pay people, retirees, and you deduct from that the future Social Security and Medicare taxes we anticipate the government will collect, you end up with a deficit. And that deficit is the unfunded liabilities. So in your mind, picture going into the future all of the money we have promised to current and future generations for Social Security, Medicare benefits. Subtract from that all of the tax revenues going into the future that we expect to collect on payroll taxes. And do a present value calculation. So take all those numbers that move into the present and tell me what are they worth in today's terms. One minus the other is unfunded liabilities. Now, there's all kinds of problems inherent in estimating unfunded liabilities. You've got to figure out what is the population growth rate, what are future inflation rates and interest rates and all of that. And so the numbers that you come up with when you attempt to estimate unfunded liabilities have a huge amount of variation to them. But they all range from the unbelievable to the ungodly. Estimates that come from both Wall Street economists and academic economists range from $100 trillion to $250 trillion. That's the present value of the unfunded liabilities. So let me say it differently. This is the amount of money the federal government would have to have on hand right now, the principal and interest from which would make up for what it is, the difference between what it's promised and what it's going to collect. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to err on the government side. We'll take the 100 trillion figure as the unfunded liabilities and see where that leaves us. So total U.S. governmental debt. We've got the federal government with its official debt of 30 trillion. We've got the unfunded liabilities of 100 trillion. But don't forget, we've also got state and local governments to deal with. State and local government debt officially is about $3.3 trillion, but the state and local governments have done the same thing the federal government has done. They have made promises to state workers, to state citizens of benefits that they don't have and will not have the money to cover. And those unfunded liabilities are about $6 trillion. So if you add that up, our entire governmental infrastructure, federal, state, local, is in hawk to the tune of $140 trillion. Now, how much is $140 trillion? Well, it turns out it's actually planetary in its scope. $140 trillion. With that much money, you could buy everything that is for sale on planet Earth, all of it, and then turn around and buy 2/3 of it again. That's $140 trillion. So if this is leaving you wondering about bankruptcy, you have indeed been paying attention. Let's talk about bankruptcy here. And again, let's leave out state and local government. I'm just going to talk about the federal government and the state and local. For all the trillions of dollars these things owe, it's a rounding error compared to what the federal government owes. So let's talk about bankruptcy in terms of the federal government. Federal debt and obligations. So that's the official debt and the unfunded liabilities are 32 times the federal government's income. The amount of money the federal government owes plus the amount it would have to have on hand right now to make up for its deficit of promised Social Security and Medicare benefits. That amount is 32 times the federal government's annual revenue. That is like a household with a $60,000 income being in debt to the tune of $450,000. I don't mean a $60,000 income household having a $450,000 mortgage. With the mortgage, you've got a $450,000 debt, but you also have a $450,000 asset on the other side. Think of this like credit card debt, that there is no asset on the other side. Now, it is the case the federal government has assets, but if you add up the value of those assets, and I'm talking about everything, take the nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and all the federal land out west and the buildings and the gold in Fort Knox and all of it, it comes out to about $5 trillion. It's about part of our rounding error. So really, think of this as a $60,000 income house with $450,000 on its credit card, but that's just the official debt. This household, in addition to owing $450,000, has promised 18 kids that it would pay for 4 years of private education. That's the magnitude of debt our federal government is in. So we take this federal debt and unfunded liabilities, that's $130 trillion. The federal government pays about 2.5% interest on its debt, and the interest it pays on its debt is market-driven. By market-driven, what I mean is the federal government auctions off its treasury bills and they go at whatever market price they go at, and so the market interest rate on the federal debt is 2.5%, and I hesitate about saying all of that because this number is heavily influenced by the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve has been holding interest rates particularly low for much of my lifetime. Let's take this 2.5% interest. With $130 trillion worth of debt and obligations, the cost of servicing that, by servicing, I mean just pay the interest on it, right? It's like making the minimum monthly payment on your credit card. You're not going to pay off the debt. You're just going to make the minimum monthly payments. That's $3.3 trillion a year. Federal government's annual income, $4 trillion. Basically, our federal government can afford the Department of Defense. That's it. If we were to take seriously the federal debt and unfunded liabilities, that is, we're going to take steps to make sure that we can afford to pay all the things that we have promised to pay and pay the debt and all of that, not even pay it off, just service it. We could afford the Department of Defense. No Social Security, no Medicare, no EPA, no CDC, no FDA, no court system, none of it. So, I claim it's mathematically impossible for the federal government to keep the promises it's made. It's not a matter of politics. It's not even a matter of economics. It's purely a matter of the mathematics. So what's the first shoe that's going to drop here? The first shoe that's going to drop is going to be Social Security. And what you're seeing here, this goes back from 1970 up to the present, this is the trust fund assets as a fraction of annual costs. So 100% is the trust, there's enough money in the trust fund to pay for 1 year of expenses. Anything above that, that's very good. When you get to zero, you've got no assets left. And you can see how Social Security, the blue line, has changed over the years. It went down, came very close to insolvency in the 1980s, turned around, became very solvent up until about 2010, where it turned around. The green is the Social Security disability. So the blue is Social Security retirement, the green is Social Security disability, the red is Medicare. What I'm about to show you are Social Security's own projections. Currently anticipating that Social Security will be bankrupt round about 2032. And I think Janet Yellen came out with some press release last week saying, good news, everybody, we've redone the calculations. It looks like Social Security will last 1 year longer than we anticipated. So 2033 instead of 2032. Does anybody know what happened back here when Social Security came very close to bankruptcy and it turned around? I wouldn't use the word restructure, but there was a major change. Social Security retirement benefits were tax-free prior to this. At this point, Congress changed the law and said, henceforth, Social Security benefits will be taxable at the federal level. That was the equivalent of a, give or take, 20% cut in Social Security benefits. In other words, at this point in time, Congress reneged on 20% of what it had promised retirees. Now, it's not going to use those words. It's going to say, well, we're going to do what's fair. We're going to tax this thing. The fact is, workers prior to that point had been promised that they weren't going to be taxed. There was a change in the rules here where Congress was not taxing and then turns around and starts taxing. That pulls Social Security out of here, and I'm going to come back and refer to that later when I talk about what I think is going to happen there. So moving forward, how bad is the debt going to get? I mean, as if the numbers I've shown you aren't depressing enough. This is the Congressional Budget Office's projection of federal debt and this is the projection they gave as of roughly 6 months ago. Federal debt from 2021 up through 2031. Today, the federal debt is 700% of federal revenues. Now, when you see politicians talk about the federal debt, they will almost never say it the way I said it here. They'll say the debt as a fraction of GDP. And they'll say things like the federal debt, if you want to know the number, I think right now it's like 140% of GDP. Here's why I don't like that. The GDP doesn't belong to the federal government. The GDP belongs to us. It's our income. The federal government's income is federal revenues. Federal revenues here is all sources of federal income, right? So taxes, fees, tariffs, whatever it is, everything the federal government collects. The debt is currently 700% of federal revenues. The Congressional Budget Office anticipates that although the debt will increase, it will drop to 650% of federal revenues. So what the CBO is projecting is, although federal debt will rise over the next decade, federal revenues will rise faster. So CBO will point to this and say, okay, things might look a bit dicey right now, but they're going to get better, relatively speaking. Here's the problem. CBO has a long track record of producing optimistic projections. I've been tracking this for a number of years now. I go back to the earliest projections that CBO makes readily available are from the 1990s. And if you track what CBO has projected to what actually happened, you see an interesting thing. What you're seeing here are CBO's 10-year ahead debt forecasts. So here's how you read this. This bar for 2007, this is a forecast that CBO made 10 years prior. CBO made this forecast in 1997. In 1997, they said, we think that by 2007, the debt will be here. This forecast for 2008, they made that in 1998. So in 1998, they said, okay, 10 years from now, the federal debt is going to be $5 trillion. And here is the forecast they made 10 years ago in 2010. In 2010, they said by 2020, the federal debt will be just north of $20 trillion. Those are the actual forecasts that CBO made over that period. Now, let me show you what actually happened. The red bars are what actually transpired. On average, some years better, some years worse, but on average, CBO's 10-year out forecasts are 55% too low. Not only are they 55% too low, you think once in a while they get it the other way, right? No, every single year they're forecasting too low. Now, you might say, okay, well, it's tough to make predictions, particularly about the future. What about their 5-year projections? Maybe they're a bit better. Well, here are their 5-year projections. And they are a bit better, but it's the same phenomenon. On average, they're about 23% too low. CBO's forecasts are rosy, and I'm just showing you here debt, but if you look at their federal tax revenue and federal spending forecasts, they're also rosy in opposite directions. CBO will consistently overpredict federal tax revenues and consistently underpredict federal spending. This is why you may have noticed over the past couple of decades, politicians have started talking about the amount of money their plans will bring in. They'll say, my plan is going to raise $3 trillion. But if you read the fine print, they always mean $3 trillion over 10 years. They're always making over 10-year predictions, which is kind of stupid on the face of it, because over the course of 10 years, Congress changes hands, the White House changes hands. There's no way whatever their plan is going to survive over that period. Part of the reason they do this is because CBO consistently produces these rosy forecasts when they're looking 10 years out. Now, in CBO's defense here, this is not a matter of CBO being stupid or partisan or anything like that. CBO is required by law to incorporate into their forecasts whatever assumptions the politicians give them. So back at the height of the housing crisis, 2008, 2009, Barack Obama was in his first couple years of his presidency. He put to CBO the question, I have this plan for moving the economy out of recession. How much tax revenue will this plan generate? And he told the CBO, assume that the economy grows at, I don't know what number he gave, but it was something like 5% per year or 7% per year over the next decade. What he asked CBO to do was to assume that for the 10 years, 2008 through 2018, our economy would grow every single year at the same rate we were growing during the dot-com boom. It was a ridiculously stupid assumption. In fact, it was one of the rare times when CBO actually put a footnote in its report to that effect. They didn't say stupid. They said, look, this assumption is, I don't even think they said untenable, but they used polite language that I'm not very good with. And they said, in effect, that this is an unreasonable assumption. But nonetheless, they're required by law to incorporate that assumption into their calculations, and lo and behold, you end up with what you end up with here. Things that are overly rosy in large part because the people who are requesting this kind of information are feeding in rosy assumptions. So let's go back to CBO's projections. This is their last set of projections. Currently, the debt is 700% of federal revenues. They're projecting 10 years into the future. Federal debt will be 650% of federal revenues. Let's do the following. We know, on average, how rosy the CBO has been historically. Let's assume that their future projections are as rosy as their previous projections have been in the past. If that's the case, if these projections are as rosy as what their past projections have been, what will the debt actually be? The debt will actually look like that. By 2031, the debt should be 1,500% of federal revenues. That's over $90 trillion 10 years from now. Now, you might look at that and say, well, surely not. That's ridiculous. Yeah, except I refer you back to 10 years ago. 10 years ago, CBO projected that the debt today would be 475% of revenues. It's actually 700%. 10 years ago, if I had told you the federal debt 10 years from now will be 700% of revenues, you would say, surely not. The same way we're saying this now. And yet, now, I'm not saying this is going to be right. There's all kinds of randomness involved. But on average, 1,500% of revenues is a better guess than 650% of revenues. Here we run into an interesting problem because our federal debt has gotten so bad, it's opened up a new problem. That is, it's not just that we owe a lot of money. We have literally run out of places on planet Earth to borrow more. In 2001, this is who the federal government owed money to. Of all the money the federal government owed, this is the official debt. 31% it owed to non-federal domestic entities, 18% of it we owed to foreign entities, 9% to the Federal Reserve, and 42% to Social Security and federal pensions. This was in 2001. Here's what it looks like today. And notice a couple of things. Non-federal domestic entities, so American citizens, American companies, state and local governments, they've increased how much they're lending to the federal government. Foreign entities, they've also increased how much they're lending to the federal government. Social Security and pensions have decreased. They've decreased because they're running out of money. It's largely Social Security. Social Security is having to cash in money that it had loaned to the federal government. It needs that money back. And so the amount of money that the federal government owes, of all the money it owes, it was 42% went to Social Security. Now it's only 21%. And so we're in this weird space where the federal government needs to borrow more money. Americans are loaning more, but not enough. Foreigners are loaning more, but not enough. Who's taking up the slack is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve went from owning 9% of the federal debt to owning 21% of the federal debt. The Federal Reserve has become the lender of last resort. And if you can think back to your principles of economics classes, in macroeconomics, this is the way we describe the Federal Reserve. It's a lender of last resort. And that's kind of ironic because what we mean by it, or at least what we meant by it when we said the Federal Reserve is lender of last resort, we meant that when a bank reaches a point where it can't get liquidity, no one will lend to it. The Federal Reserve is a lender of last resort. We set it up so that we don't have a repeat of what we had in the Great Depression where you want to take your money out of the bank and the bank's got to borrow some money in order to give you your money and there's nobody who's going to loan the bank the money and now the bank has to close. The Federal Reserve was set up to be the lender of last resort to the banks. Well, here's the irony. It has become the lender of last resort to the federal government because there's nobody left to loan the federal government the massive amount of money that it needs to borrow. But here's the thing. The Fed is unlike all the other lenders because when the Federal Reserve lends to the government, something happens that doesn't happen when anybody else lends. And that is the money supply goes up. When the Federal Reserve loans to the federal government, you get an increase in the money supply. And what you see here is going back to 2010. From 2010 up to 2020, the dawn of COVID, you can see the money supply grew at a pretty constant 6% annual rate until the age of COVID, where we had a number of quantitative easings and stimulus packages, and the money supply grew 20%. The way we paid for the multi-trillion-dollar stimulus packages over the past few years was largely by printing money. And what does that do? Well, it gives you inflation. Inflation prior to the age of COVID averaged, you can see it's up and down, but it averaged about 2%. After the age of COVID, it averages 5% and going up with each passing month. Now, here's a weird thing. The money supply growth increased by 13 percentage points, post versus pre-COVID. Inflation increased 3 percentage points, post versus pre-COVID. Now, again, if you think back to your macroeconomics principles class, what should dawn on you is that if you get a 13 percentage point increase in money growth, you should, plus or minus, get about 13 percentage point increase in inflation. Where's the missing 10%? How is it that we had this massive increase in the growth of the money supply? And yes, we got some inflation, but we didn't get the massive inflation. And you notice you don't hear as much about MMT anymore. But back when inflation was here, you heard lots about MMT. And what were they saying? They were saying, go ahead and print all the money you want. You're not going to get massive inflation. Indeed, we didn't. And even with the printing of the money and the ensuing inflation that we've seen to this point, it's still not anywhere near what we would expect. I would expect 13% inflation, and I'm only seeing 3. Where's the missing 10? The orange is the height of the COVID crisis. The blue is real GDP. That's the actual economy, adjusted for inflation. It's the actual economy. The red is the S&P 500. Now, look at this. We started to go into recession, or what looked like a recession just prior to COVID. And then we hit COVID with the lockdown, so we do this. This was the largest contraction in the economy since the Great Depression. Our unemployment rate hit 14%, almost 15% in this country. Again, the highest by far since the Great Depression. We're talking about an event that is number 2 only to the Great Depression. And what happened to stocks during this? Okay, we had a downturn here. If you do the math, that's a downturn of about 3%. But then it turns around and goes up. Now, we started to unlock the economy, and the economy was turning back. But notice what was happening during this period where the stock market over this period, this was like second to third quarter of 2020, I think gained something like 25% or something, S&P 500. The S&P 500 gained 25% during a period in which our unemployment was still, even at the end of this, it was still 9%. It was still the highest that we've had since the Great Depression. And there was tremendous uncertainty. Nobody knew when the lockdowns were going to completely end. Nobody knew what we were going to look like when we came out the other end. Tremendous uncertainty, and yet the stock market was booming. That's weird. I claim that what was going on is that the inflation that we were missing, I'm asking where's that extra 10% inflation we should be seeing? I claim it was hiding in the stock market. That 25% bump you saw was actually due to inflation. Now, we don't call it inflation because officially inflation is a rise in the price of consumer goods. Stock prices aren't included in inflation calculations. In fact, when the stock market goes up, we all cheer and say, this is wonderful news. I claim that what was really going on is the stock market was rising because of the money the Fed was pumping into the economy. And here we can see this. If you compare money growth with inflation, and this is the thing MMT advocates will show you, you'll see this. Across the bottom is growth in the money supply. This is 2013 to 2022. Growth in the money supply across there, inflation up and down. And you don't see much of anything going on. I mean, if you read the principles textbooks, they should tell you this should look like a upward 45-degree line, right? It doesn't. It's kind of pretty much flat. And MMTers will point to this and say, see, you can grow the money supply and you're not going to get massive inflation. If my hypothesis is correct, that the inflation was hiding in the stock market, what we should be comparing is not the growth in the money supply to inflation. We should be comparing the growth in the money supply to inflation and the growth in stock prices. And if you do that, you see this. Going back 18 months, I said inflation is hiding in the stock market, and people said, no, that can't be right. And I said, watch. When we come out of COVID, 2 things are going to happen. First, the stock market's going to top off or even drop as people now comfortable with the future start to sell off stocks and move their money into real goods and services. And one, the stock market tops out or possibly even falls. And the second is you're going to start to see serious inflation because now those dollars are going to register in the prices of goods and services. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we saw. So what happened is the money growth landed mostly in financial markets where it elevated stock prices. So this is the Federal Reserve printing all the money it printed. Stock prices aren't included in inflation calculations, so it looks like inflation is nice and tame. Our inflation numbers remain low. As the crisis passes, the money starts to move out of stocks into goods and services, and then inflation numbers start to shoot up. Oh, and by the way, I didn't put it on this slide, but I'll tell you, my guess, and it's only a guess, do with it what you like, but my back of the envelope calculation is we're going to be seeing consistent 5% plus inflation. This is not a transitory thing. This is a permanent thing. Strike that. It's permanent until Congress manages to balance its budget, because that's the ultimate problem here. Congress continues to run deficits, and now trillion-dollar deficits have become the norm. Those deficits are having to be funded by printing money, not entirely, but in part. And when we print the money, we get the inflation. So how do we get here? There were 3 barriers that constrained the federal government, and all 3 of them failed. The first was the voters. You vote the bums out. The problem is, politicians learned that they can buy us off. Now, it's illegal for me to offer you money to vote for me, but it's perfectly legal for me to offer you his money to vote for me. And that's exactly what I do. I say, look, elect me, and I'll give you a bunch of stuff. And you cheer, and you say, yeah, that's great, we like stuff. And somebody says, excuse me, how are you going to pay for this? And then you start to get upset, and there's grumbling of how is he going to pay for this. No problem. I'm going to tax these two people here. And with their money, I'm going to give you all this stuff. And so they're quite annoyed. I don't care. There's two of them. The rest of you are quite happy. That's great. I get elected. And in effect, this is what politicians have learned to do, is to buy off the voters with other people's money. And so we don't vote the bums out. Actually, we vote the bums in. I'm happy to vote out somebody else's bum, but my particular bum, I like him. He's giving me stuff. Second failure is the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 lists 8 or 9 things the federal government is allowed to do. And that's it. Those are the only things the federal government is allowed to do. And round about the 1920s in this country, we decided as a society that we wanted the federal government to take a heavier hand in our lives. And we pushed and we pushed and we pushed and we pushed hard enough that the Supreme Court started to read all sorts of things into the Constitution that weren't there. And so they do all sorts of backflips to argue why it's appropriate that the federal government have a say in how much wheat you grow on your farm, even if the wheat that you're growing is not crossing state lines. Not only is it not involving interstate commerce, it's not involving commerce at all. And yet the Supreme Court finds a way to say, no, the federal government does have a say in what's going on here. We did this repeatedly. We push and we push and we push. And so the constitutional constraints disappear. The third failure is we went off the gold standard. There's nothing magical about gold. People say, well, gold has inherent value. That's why you should have a gold standard. Nothing has inherent value. The only reason gold has value is because other people want it. Because I could walk into a bar and put it on the table and people will give me things. It's the things I want. That's what makes gold valuable. The fact that people will give me things in exchange for it. Well, that's the same thing that makes dollars valuable. People will give me things in exchange for them. What makes the gold standard valuable isn't the gold. It's that the quantity of gold is fixed. There's only so much there. And if by law your dollars are tied to the gold, and there's only so much gold, there can only be so much dollars. And all of a sudden you no longer have the ability to print all of this money that's now creating all of this inflation that we're seeing. And as you print all this money, all of a sudden you make it much more possible for the government and the politicians to do all sorts of things they want to do that they otherwise couldn't afford. What happens next? I think, and this is in no particular order, and my opinion as to what the order is changes over time. So take the order however you like. We're going to see means testing for Social Security. You're going to see that within the decade. Politicians are going to start saying things like Social Security was not intended for everybody. It was supposed to be a safety net for the poorest of the poor. We need to return to that. And remember that graph I showed you where Social Security solvency went down to near zero and it turned around, came back up again. And I said, look, what happened here? Congress changed the rules, started taxing Social Security benefits. That's identical to a 20% cut in Social Security benefits. Coincidentally, Social Security Administration anticipates that to keep Social Security solvent into the future, we need to cut benefits by about 20%, or raise payroll taxes by about 20%. Now, I would be very surprised to see a rise in payroll taxes, largely because raising taxes is a political non-starter. Cutting Social Security benefits is also a political non-starter, but I think of the two, this one's a little bit easier, depending on how you do it. So one of the ways I do it is I start off by saying, look at what's intended for everybody. How many of you you're in high school or college? You just graduated college, and some of you recently graduated college. Somewhere between now and 10 years from now, you're going to find politicians looking at you and saying, you have nice jobs. You have employers who provide you with IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, all sorts of nice retirement plans that are going to make sure that you're well taken care of when you retire. You don't need Social Security. You've got this private pension, retirement. Furthermore, how is it that you have these nice jobs that are providing all of these retirement benefits? You have them because you got an education. How did you get that education? The federal government subsidized your loans. It's time for you to give back. And the way you're going to give back is by not receiving Social Security, or receiving a much smaller Social Security than what you anticipated. And it's okay. You've got 40 years, 50 years to retirement. You'll be fine. These are the words you're going to hear. You're going to start to hear them in about 10 years. Second, you're going to see new taxes, and you already hear the rumblings of this. And this, if there's one thing in the economy that keeps me up at night, it's this. Proposed taxes on wealth and unrealized gains. First off, this is unprecedented. Yes, local governments tax wealth. You get property taxes, this sort of thing. States may do it as well here and there. But the federal government has never taxed wealth. In fact, constitutionally, while the states and local governments the states can do whatever they want, and the local governments under the auspices of the state can do whatever they want, under the Constitution, the federal government can tax your income. We had a constitutional amendment to that end. The constitutional amendment does not permit the federal government to tax your wealth. I have a strong suspicion that if politicians end up pushing on this, they're not going to go the constitutional amendment route. They're going to ask the Supreme Court to do what the Supreme Court has done for the past 80 years. Which is come up with some reason why we can do this. And so they're going to start taxing wealth, and they're going to start taxing unrealized gains. And if that happens, I think that second one's a lesser likelihood than the first. But taxing unrealized gains is going to be a body blow to the stock market that makes 1929 look like a walk in the park. I buy a stock and it goes up and I owe taxes on this thing. What if I don't have the money to pay for it? Doesn't matter that I haven't cashed the stock in yet. I'm being taxed on an unrealized gain. We're going to see higher taxes on the middle classes. If you look at the numbers, we have a group of people in this country who are not paying their fair share. And politicians are right about this. What they're wrong about is who it is. If you look at the numbers, and when I say look at the numbers, I mean count all sources of income, whatever they are, wage income, capital gains, dividends, rental income, inheritance, whatever it is. All of your income, count it. And count all of your federal taxes, no matter what those taxes are. After you've done your accounting, deductions, and exemptions and all of the acrobatics that you do, divide one by the other, you get an effective average tax rate. The effective average tax rate is positive. It's a positive number for only 40% of the population. For the other 60%, it's a negative number. That is, 60% of us receive more back from the federal government than we pay in the first place. Who's not paying their fair share? It turns out to be the poor and the middle class. Now, the problem here is, of course, the poor don't have much to tax. The middle class have something to tax, not as much as the rich do, but there are a hell of a lot more of them. The middle classes in this country have twice the income of the top 1%. And while the top 1% is taxed at an average effective rate of around 30% plus, the middle classes are taxed at an average rate of around 0. They're an untapped resource. I think we're going to start to see higher taxes on the middle class. We're going to see money printing and inflation because of all these things that I've shown you, this politically is the easiest one to get away with. Is there a way out? Turns out there is. First, cut federal spending 10%. And when I say cut federal spending, I don't mean like a politician. When a politician says cut spending 10%, what he means is he's going to accept an increase that's 10% less than the increase he actually wanted. I mean, actually cut federal spending 10%. Then freeze it for 6 years. No increases. Not for politics, not for inflation, for nothing. At the 7th year, you will have a balanced budget. Turns out, our government consistently is about 6 years further into the future than the economy is capable of handling. If you can cut the budget by about 10% and then hold it in stasis for 6 years, that's 6 years the economy grows. It catches up to the federal government. And then finally, in year 7, we've got an economy that's large enough that can handle the federal government. Then if you want to grow federal spending, go for it. Just don't increase it faster than the economy. You do that, and you will have a balanced budget before that second shoe drops with Social Security. Now, the problem, of course, is this is politically untenable. And so, I don't know where we end up. If you have enjoyed, to the extent one can enjoy such a topic, I have a weekly podcast, Words and Numbers, where I and my colleague, who's a political scientist, talk about stuff like this. We're on all the major podcast players. And I highly recommend our recent book, Cooperation and Coercion, where we talk about topics like the debt. The debt actually takes up a whole chapter. We talk about all sorts of things, guns, the war on drugs, immigration, all sorts of things, from the perspective of an economist and a political scientist. You can find us on Amazon and on Audible, an audiobook.